let's go ahead and get started. So speakers, you've all got 15 minutes each, as you know. For folks in attendance, you can submit questions through the Q&A function as people are speaking, but we'll collect all of those and then do questions together at the end. So when you submit, you won't be able to see your question appear and other people won't, but rest assured that those are coming to us. And then when it gets time to for Q&A, we'll probably call on you and you can speak your question yourself if you'd like. But otherwise, let's jump straight into it. So we're going to start with Nikita Arora, who's a PhD candidate in health economics funded by the Wellcome Trust at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So Nikita does research on the behavior and preferences of health workers in Ethiopia and Ghana, with the view to informing policies that can retain them in the health workforce in the long term. So Nikita, I'm going to put down my slides, and if you can put yours up, you can then take it away.
Thank you, Martin. Sorry, 1 second. Great, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Super. Great, thank you for inviting me to present. So I'm from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and this works in collaboration with folks from the University of Leeds and Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Jumping straight into the study rationale and what got us to do what we did. We worked from the understanding that health systems, particularly in low and middle income countries, require to retain health workers to be able to deliver healthcare in public sector jobs. There's quite a lot of literature that says that understanding, if policymakers are able to understand what people value in their jobs, what these health workers care about in their jobs, they should theoretically be able to align the policy incentives that they're offered and retain them in the longer run. And then there's also a large body of literature in psychology that suggests that people's work motivation could be a predictor of what they value in their jobs. So that got us to our research question, which basically what we set out to do was to understand if people's overall motivation or health workers' overall motivation and the extent to which they may be extrinsically or intrinsically motivated, does that influence the job attributes or characteristics they value, and thus the amount of utility they attach to a given job. What I mean by motivation is a definition by the motivation intensity approach from psychology. But what I really want to sort of focus on is to say that motivation is not just one thing, it's a multidimensional construct. And the two main dimensions of motivation could be intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsically motivated people, quite in a lay terms, they are people who are driven by the tasks at hand, they're driven by the job itself. They don't care so much about their salaries or external rewards. Extrinsically motivated people, on the contrary, are actually people who are driven by external aspects to their jobs, such as salary or praise from supervisors. So with that background in mind, we set out to do our work in Ethiopia in 2019, where we conducted a study with just over 200 community health workers called health extension workers in 4 regions, which comprise of over 80% of the country's population. They were Tigray, Oromia, SNNPR, and Amhara. Who are these community health workers or health extension workers? They are salaried full-time community health workers. They deliver really important primary healthcare interventions. And just to give you an extent of how large this workforce is, it's the 2nd largest health workforce in the country, massively, superseding doctors, nurses, and midwives. And a substantial amount of the recurrent health expenditure gets allocated to their salaries. So it's a really important health workforce that the country is really investing in. So therefore, it's quite important to understand what they really care about in their jobs. Just a quick sort of table on descriptives. The mean age of our participants was around 28 years. They earned about £51 per month. But the average person had spent slightly over 3 years in the health system. The sample was had more people from the south, which was Oromia and SNNPR. And the highest qualification, so very few people had a higher degree above what was needed to be a community health worker. So level 1 to 4 is just different levels of grades of community health worker training that they can receive. So, okay, so with that view, our first objective is to really understand the stated preferences. So they are hypothetical preferences of the health extension workers for job level incentives. To do so, we did a discrete choice experiment, which a few of you may be familiar with. They are quantitative techniques that have been used by economists for a while now, and they present respondents with a series of hypothetical choice tasks, and they expect respondents, and these choice tasks comprise of 2 or more mutually exclusive alternatives, which have multiple attributes, and people are asked to choose from them. So here's an example from the health workforce. So it's like asking a health worker to choose between job A, job B. Both these jobs are characterized by a set of attributes, salary, location, etc. And the health worker is asked, well, if all else was equal, which job you would prefer? And the idea is that they would trade off between the different attributes of the job and choose the job alternative A or B, which gives them most utility. And this here is one choice task. And normally in a discrete choice experiment, people would be choosing, or respondents would be choosing between, multiple choice tasks to create a panel data set so that you can understand how people are trading off between attributes. So in our study, we showed respondents 7 choice tasks, which had 2 jobs, which varied in 6 different attributes, which are given in this table. And then in addition to the 2 jobs, we also had an opt-out, or the option to not choose either of the 2 jobs. And this was to model unconditional demand and to see if people just wanted to stay in their jobs. And that was just modeled as a constant without any attributes. So 3 of the attributes, the top 3 had 3 levels each, and the bottom 3 had 2 levels each, and each one of the attribute level was dummy coded. And so here's an example choice task. So every respondent, every community health worker saw 7 of these. Great. Okay, so the second bit of data that we needed to collect was on motivation. So we did that with in a cross-sectional survey where there was the DCE with the same sample. We had them respond to a motivation tool, which had 30 statements of 30 items, each on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. And I'll show you the tool in a second. So we collected that information on motivation simultaneously as well. So that gets me to a very methodological point. So we've got these 2 different points of, we've got these 2 different bits of data, one on motivation and one on how people are choosing their jobs, or how people are about their preferences for different attributes. So there's a lot of literature in health economics that says that actually psychological constructs like motivation and attitudes, they should not, they're not observed by the tool at hand. There's only functions of it that you can capture by asking people in a tool how motivated you are. And so because of that, they can't be looked at as deterministic components. It's not like age or gender. So you shouldn't be treating them in a regression equation like independent variables. They should rather be treated as dependent variables, because otherwise that would lead to endogeneity bias and measurement error. So in health economics and also in other, I think in transport and environment economics, there's something called hybrid choice framework or hybrid choice approach, which essentially allows you to adequately model the stated choice component of, to see the behavior of the respondents, but also really be able to incorporate the attitudinal questions that we talked about, like motivation. So on the left is essentially a normal discrete choice experiment choice analysis structure. So it says that different attributes of the alternative and respondent characteristics like age, sex, etc., they contribute to the utility of an alternative, which can be seen through the choices that they make in a discrete choice experiment. What the hybrid choice analysis structure now allows us to do is that methodologically correctly, it allows us to really link the influence of latent variables, which in our case is motivation, to the general structure of choice, and so that you're able to model both of those together adequately. All right, so in our case, the latent variable that we had was motivation. Like I said, I stressed upon the fact that motivation is not just one thing; it's multidimensional, the concept. So in order to find out in our tool of 30 questions how many dimensions there were, so we did an exploratory factor analysis, and we got 3 factors that loaded up to different statements loaded up to different factors. And each factor was included in our model as a latent variable. So the bits in gray was the first factor, was the first latent variable, which was intrinsic motivation based on the wording of the questions. Second was the second latent variable, which was general contentment with the job. And the third was extrinsic motivation. So I thought I put in a quick slide on the modeling framework for people who may not be familiar with discrete choice experiments. So the way these are modeled, they're modeled most commonly in a random utility framework, which McFadden gave back in 1974, which essentially says that the utility of an alternative for respondent N, alternative I, and in a choice situation T can be given as the sum of the observable bit of, or the things you can model, and the things that you can't model. So the things that are unobserved. So the VINT is the part of the utility that as an analyst you can model through, because that's contingent on the attributes that you include in your model and other things. And epsilon is noise, or the unobserved, the random heterogeneity that you can't sort of take care of. And further, your observable component is essentially, can be seen as a vector of the attributes that you include in your choice situation. So in our job, in our particular case, there were the 6 attributes. They formed the various x's, and the betas were the taste coefficients associated with each one of them. So that's the general framework of discrete choice experiments. That's how they're modeled. In a hybrid choice model, what it really allows you to do is, and this is a very dumbed down version really, because there's a lot of equations which I don't want to bother everybody with, but essentially what it does is it says that betas are no longer point estimates. First of all, you can really allow random heterogeneity by allowing the distribution. So you've got the mean involved and the standard deviation. And this beta is for an average salary. So it's just an example for average salary. So you've got the mean and the standard deviation. So you allow for random heterogeneity, but you also allow certain components that allow you to capture the effect of the latent variables that you included in your model and their association on the preferences for that particular attribute. So how the latent variables, so we've got 3, associate with people's preferences for an average salary. So that's what the hybrid choice model allows you to do. So I thought I wouldn't.
You've got about 5 minutes left, Nikita.
Cool. I should be done quicker. So I deliberately didn't include tables here, but plotted quick correlation plots between different latent variables. And so on the x-axis here, we've got intrinsic motivation, which was latent variable 1. And on the y-axis is people's preferences for a higher than average salary. This is essentially the theta in the equation. And you can really see that as health workers become, as they move from left to right, as they become more intrinsically motivated, their preferences for a higher than average salary goes down. If you see the correlation between intrinsic motivation and preferences for a heavy workload, you can see that as people move from left to right, as these health workers become more intrinsically motivated, their preferences for a heavy workload really neutralizes. So they don't care so much about having a heavy workload. If you see on the contrary, so this is an association between extrinsic motivation, which is the opposite of intrinsic motivation. And on the left, it's the association between extrinsic motivation and preference for a higher than average salary. It's quite the opposite. It sees that you can see that as you move from left to right, as people become more extrinsically motivated, they care more for a higher than average salary. And on the right, you see as they become more extrinsically motivated, they start disliking a heavier workload more. So this is just to show, so these were like the top sort of findings which show the association, the link between how you're motivated and what your preferences for a job could be. And I thought this was a really good graph to show what was the extent of variation that could be captured by this model. So the hybrid choice in this approach allows you to disentangle random heterogeneity in tastes from variation in tastes due to motivation in our case. So you can see that a large amount of this variation was driven by motivation, different types of motivation, intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, and general contentment. And so this is one of the first few studies that show that actually there's if you use the right approach, you can actually capture a huge part of random heterogeneity and see how that, what percentage of that is due to people's motivation. So just to conclude, what we did was we used multidimensional motivation as a source of heterogeneity in preferences to show that if you're able to include these types of attitudinal and psychological constructs in your model as a choice analyst, you will probably be able to get additional insights. If you're doing so, if you're using attitudinal questions, don't just include them as interaction terms, because that would be wrong. And hybrid choice analysis, and if it's in the paper, if you'll see that we've also actually estimated more simpler models to show that actually hybrid choice analysis, there's a much better goodness of fit in comparison to other models. So if you were to model these things using a more complicated structure like the hybrid choice analysis structure would be a good use. And that finally, as policymakers, if you're trying to understand what people in your workforce, as policymakers and managers, if you're trying to understand what people care about in your workforce, to be able to give them what they want and to be able to retain them in the long run, these types of constructs ought to be included in understanding what drives them to provide their labor. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikita. That was a super interesting presentation and really kind of important and creative and also very policy relevant work. And you also get the first gold star of the day for coming in 1 minute of your time. So folks in the audience, please either put your questions in through the Q&A function for Nikita or write them down so that you remember them when we get to the end. We're now going to move on to Damien Dewalt. So Damien's a lead economist in the development research group at the World Bank. He does research at the intersection of health, education, and social protection. And a lot of that focuses on the design and impact of incentives in these fields. So we're fortunate that we have a quite coherent panel, and these same themes of motivation and task characteristics, I think, run through Damien's paper as well as some of the others that are going to follow too. So Damien, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to present our paper entitled Love the Job or the Patient, Task versus Mission-Based Motivation in Healthcare. This is joint work with my co-authors Sheria Banouri at the University of East Anglia and Phil Kiefer at the Inter-American Development Bank. And as Martin said, I think it's a good continuation from Nikita's presentation. So what we do in this paper is try to distinguish the contributions of two sources of non-pecuniary motivation: the degree to which employees work harder for a mission that they value, and we'll call that mission motivation, and the extent to which the nature of the task itself motivates workers to exert extra effort, and we'll call it task motivation. There are many sources of motivation for engaging in effort. There is extrinsic motivation, which is basically pay, but also punishment and rewards, and mission-based pro-social motivation. There's also social motivation, like comparison with peers, tournaments. And there is also the intrinsic or the task motivation. And you might ask, why does the source of the motivation matter? Most public organizations, including my own organization, the World Bank, and we have a picture there, has some form of a mission statement. For us, is to end poverty. And this mission statement is usually pro-social. Organizations spend a lot of resources reinforcing the mission of their organization. And it's an important source of motivation, not just for volunteers, but also for employees. But one good question is whether it increases effort. My co-authors, Sheria Banouri and Phil Kiefer, have shown in a paper in 2016 in Indonesia that it does. However, there is mission motivation, but task motivation that also increases effort. A lot of the research, including Nikita's paper, compare mainly extrinsic or money motivation versus task motivation. What we try to do in this study is something a little bit different. We extract from extrinsic motivation. We'll see that everyone receives the same amount, but we compare task versus mission motivation. So what we do in this lab in the field experiment that we ran in Burkina Faso, our subjects are medical and nursing students in the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. They're all provided a salary, a fixed payment of 4,000 CFA francs, that is about 7.8 US dollars. And during this lab in the field experiment, they're asked to engage in a task. And they are not paid piece rate. So that's not what we are looking at. We are looking at task versus mission motivation. They all receive the same fixed salary. Each round of the task lasts for 2 minutes. At the end of each round, the subjects are asked whether they would like to repeat the task. And this continues for an unknown to them maximum of 16 times, so 32 minutes. What we manipulate in the lab in the fixed experiment is 2 components. The task motivation, we vary the task. I'll come back to that, but we have an extremely low motivation task, which is just staring at a blank computer screen. We have also low motivation task, which is just aligning sliders on a computer screen. And we have what we think is a higher motivation task, especially for this type of participant medical and nursing students, which is to look at a video with a medical case and diagnose and treat and propose a treatment. So that's the manipulation on the task motivation side. On the mission motivation, with some participants will have no mission motivation, and some, for them, their additional effort will provide money to a charity. In our case, it will be a primary school in a poor neighborhood. So key measure of effort will be the number of times the task is repeated. There will be a secondary effort measure, which is the number of correct answers or number of sliders correctly aligned. So let's describe the 3 tasks. So the first one is extremely boring, is do nothing, sit and stare at a blank screen for 2 minutes. And it's meant to be very boring, and it just captures the opportunity cost of time. Second task, well, it's also boring. It's the slider task, which was introduced by Gill and Prowse. It's a simple motor skill-based task. The subjects are given 2 minutes to move as many sliders as they can from left to center on the computer screen. It's boring. There is absolutely minimum intrinsic motivation, but it has the advantage to allow accurate computerized measurement of effort. You can just count the measure of sliders that are correctly aligned on the screen. The third task is higher motivation. It's a medical task. And remember, our participants are students in either a nursing school or a medical school. And we need a task which requires effort and knowledge in a medical context, which is expected. And also we expect its high task motivation higher than sliders, than aligning the sliders anyway. The standard approach to measuring medical knowledge is to use survey vignettes, usually paper vignettes, providing the subjects with a list of symptoms and asking them to provide a diagnosis. We've taken a similar approach, but we make it a little bit more entertaining, engaging, with videos presenting a patient with either maternal symptoms or symptoms for their child, and visiting the clinic. So you'll see we'll videos with an actress, and the subjects view the video that are about 60 seconds, and they are asked to select the correct diagnosis, the correct treatment, the correct follow-up schedule, and if the first treatment fails, the correct alternate treatment. So let me give you an example, and this was all in French, but I've translated one case here. You see here our actress, and she basically, the case is, I'm going to read it out loud. Hello, I'm here today because I'm very worried about my child. He's about 2 years old. Over the past 2 weeks, he has been suffering from seizures. He often loses consciousness and has fever and chills. I've tried to use cold packs to treat the fever, but it is not making a difference at all. I'm so worried because he's not eating at all. Just last night, He vomited twice, but even though he refused to eat. I brought him here because his condition is really worrying me. His eyes are so pale and he looks to be so very tired and exhausted. I don't understand what is happening to him. He has all the vaccine completed 1 year ago. So following this video, then the subjects have to answer 4 questions on a multiple choice format. Basically, the first question is, what is the most probable diagnosis? In the case I just showed you, it's severe malaria. Second question, what is the most appropriate treatment? In our case, is quinine intravenous. Then the third question is, when should you see the patient for a follow-up after the completion of the initial treatment? Correct answer is 3 days. And fourth question is, what is likely to be the best alternative treatment for the patient if the patient's condition does not improve? The correct answer is to give artemether. So that was a description of the 3 tasks. I repeat: staring at a blank screen, the slider task, and then this video vignettes, and where you have to provide correct diagnosis and treatment. So then how do we introduce the mission motivation? So basically, any effort in the 3 tasks will produce money that will be given to a primary school in a poor neighborhood outside of Ouagadougou. And you can see the picture of these schools, and the participants will also see these pictures, and they will know from experience that this is a poor school. So in the blank task, for each 2-minute subject stares at the blank screen, that will generate 200 CFA francs for the primary school. In the slider task, for each slider correctly placed, that will generate 10 CFA francs for the school. In the medical task, for each question correctly answered, it will generate 100 CFA francs for the primary school. So that's how we introduce the mission. Now, if you combine both the 3 tasks and whether or not there is a mission motivation, this comes to 6 treatments in a 3x2 design. And here you have a table showing how the subject has been randomly allocated into the different bins for these 6 treatments. So we have in the columns the 3 tasks. So I've explained the blank task, the slider task, and the medical task. And then for each of the two tasks, some subject, there is no mission motivation, no donation to the school. Okay, they just do their task, and then they got their 4,000 CFA francs at the end. And for some of them, there is this additional mission motivation with the donation to the school. Okay, and for them, effort matters. It generates public goods, is donation to the school. So a few other experiment details. Those are 4- or 5th-year medical students. 121 are from the medical school at the University of Ouagadougou. 131 are nursing students from the nursing school in Ouagadougou. The session length were about 1 hour, including the payment. The average payment to the subject was 5,732 CFA. That's a little bit more than the 4,000 of the fixed salary, because they have a few other tasks before the main task that I will explain in the next slide. And the average payment to the charity was 972 CFA francs. All the treatments were conducted on-site at the respective institution using a mobile lab.
Just under 5 minutes left, Damien.
Sure. So the structure of the experiment. So we start with a motivation measure, which is a simple dictator game. You have an endowment, and you can decide to keep some for you, and the other one you give to this school that we've seen. And you can therefore earn some money with that. And then we have 2 measures of ability for the sliders task, and it's paid piece rate, and the medical task, it's also paid piece rate. That explains how the subject would receive a little bit more than the 5,000 CFA francs on average. And then we have this main task that I've explained in more detail, and then we do an exit survey. So in summary, we conduct an experiment with medical and nursing students in Burkina Faso. The subjects are provided with a flat identical salary. They are asked to engage in an effort task for as long as they like. There are 3 types of tasks, depending on the treatment: blank, slider, and medical. 2 are boring, one is more motivating. And so we manipulate task motivation. And then we cross the treatments, introducing a mission motivation, where effort for some of them generates money for a post-score. And subjects can end the experiment at any time. So those are a few summary statistics that I will go very quickly over it. So you see the average age, 50% of our participants are female, 47% study to become a doctor, 20% to become a nurse, and 25% to become a midwife. So what are the results? Does task motivation matter? The answer is a resounding yes, at least for the medical task. Subjects are significantly more likely to continue to do the experiment for longer in the medical task treatment on the right. And you see that for the blank and the slider task type, they stop very quickly before 2 rounds, whereas for the medical task, they continue for up to 5 rounds on average. Second question, does mission matter? Okay, and here we conclude that mission increases effort. The impact of mission declines as task motivation increases. So what you see for the 2 boring tasks, you see the shaded gray is when we add the mission motivation, you see that especially for the blind task, there is an increase in the number of rounds that are done. A little bit, but not significant for the slider. But then for the medical task, there is no additional increase from adding the mission motivation. Basically, it's still much higher than for the blank and the slider task, but there is no additional increase brought by the mission, by adding the mission. So this table, I'm not going to go into the detail, but it's basically the same results, but in a regression framework, and we have 4 specification controlling for several of the variables that we included, and we have the same results. So basically, the omitted task is the blank with no mission. You see that adding the mission increased for the blank task and the slider, adding the mission motivation. But both type of medical tasks are much higher, and there is no additional increase if you add the mission to a motivation to the medical task. Our conclusion is that there are large gains in effort due to task motivation. Mission motivation increases effort when task motivation is low, such as in the blank and slider task, but there was no impact found when the task motivation is high. So it's evidence in favor of diminishing returns to mission motivation. What does this all mean? If we can screen for task motivation, we should, and we should prioritize it because it's the larger increase in effort. Adding mission motivation to the workplace can also be useful, but maybe only for low task motivation tasks. The bottom line is that matching workers to tasks that motivate them seems far more important than for effort than mission matching. And I will end up here. Thank you very much.
Huge thanks, Damien. You get, I guess I'll also give you a gold star because you were on time. You weren't under time, but that was a really great and clear presentation of a paper that presents a kind of really a really nice insight that I think adds something to a lot of the work that kind of all of us are familiar with on service delivery kind of workers and what motivates them. So I'm going to hand over now to Zahra, who's going to talk more about motivation. So Zahra is a postdoc at the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford and does a lot of work with governments in South Asia and Africa on incentives and management practices and policy implementation. So Zahra, over to you. Oh, and for people in the audience, again, just a reminder to please submit questions for Damien or write them down for when we get to question time after Zahra and Gabriela's presentations. So go ahead, Zahra.
Thanks, Martin. So I'm going to switch over to education. And today I'll be speaking about work which looks at the impact of recognition rewards for head teachers. So I'll jump right in. So we know that motivating public sector employees is essential for effective public service delivery and development and growth. And many organizations, they tend to use financial incentives to elicit higher effort. But we know from some of the presentations today how intrinsic motivations are important, and financial incentives can crowd out different types of intrinsic motivations. Non-financial incentives, on the other hand, are less costly, and we know they can be effective in pro-social settings like education or health that are citizen-facing, where we've seen that agents may put a lower weight on financial incentives. And when we think about these kind of recognition rewards, these are not uncommon in government, and many governments do roll out recognition schemes, but there appears to be limited evidence on how these actually work in practice, or the question of how should governments design these to make them more effective is something that's an open question. So essentially, there's two types of questions. One is a question of what are the channels for employee motivation when we look at recognition? And there's essentially, theory tells us there could be two types of channels. So agents may value employee recognition because it gives them an opportunity for peer esteem to be recognized in front of their peers and colleagues. At the same time, they may use recognition as a tool to value their quality to supervisors, which can generate tangible career benefits in the future. So peer esteem and career benefits, these are two distinct motivations, which has implications for design and also how we understand about why agents exert effort in response to these rewards. There's another question about how these rewards should be framed. And this is relevant and important because we've seen in theory, both by economists and psychologists, how performance contingent rewards can sometimes be perceived as controlling, and they can dampen employee morale and beliefs and capabilities. And this can especially be more pronounced in tournament-based recognition rewards, where, especially for low ability individuals or individuals who have low motivation at baseline. So fundamentally, what this means is that with these kind of rewards, equilibrium effort does not only depend on the reward itself, but also on the information contained in the reward, which makes their framing important. But there's limited evidence on both these questions. First, what are the channels for motivation when we think of these types of rewards? And two, is there any impact of framing these rewards to improve their overall design? So in this paper, I essentially try to tackle with these gaps in the field and try to generate empirical evidence on the impact of employer recognition on head teacher effort. And in particular, I collaborate with the Punjab Teacher Training Academy, where we essentially designed 4 different types of recognition schemes that are offered to head teachers, and the recognition schemes are tied to training test scores. And essentially, if you think about the 2 gaps that I just presented, 2 of the treatment arms essentially look at the channels. So one makes peer esteem salient, and the other one makes career benefit salient. And then there are 2 additional arms, which are mirror images of the first 2 treatments, but essentially try to address the second gap. So we add a motivational framing to both these arms. So there's a 2x2 with the channels or the framing, and then there's a control group. Okay. I had colored them so I could highlight them as I spoke about them, but we'll move on. So the questions are linked to this design that I just showed you. So the first question is about the channels. We're asking whether employer recognition can elicit higher effort, and is the impact of recognition that makes peer esteem salient higher or lower than recognition that makes career benefit salient? Then we look at the second question, which addresses the second column in the 2x2. Does framing employer recognition with motivation information improve their design and impact? So these are the questions. I'll tell you a bit more about the experiment and then the results. So where are we doing this? So we're doing this in the context of the Punjab education sector. This is a pretty large sector with about 450,000 teachers, 50,000 schools. Learning outcomes are lagging, as in many other low to middle income countries. And this has naturally led to a lot of discussions in the government about how to harness teacher motivation. In view of that, the government actually conducted a teacher motivation survey with around 8,000 teachers. And that actually showed that 70% of the teachers valued non-financial incentives like recognition community recognition, more so than financial incentives. So this is a setting where understanding whether these kind of tools, can be effective, will have policy implications. The experiment is specifically in collaboration with the Punjab Teacher Training Academy. So this is the academy that has the mandate to train all pre-service and in-service teachers in Punjab. The experiment is specifically embedded within a mandatory in-service training for head teachers on school leadership. We focus on 7 districts, which are basically spread across the north, south, and the center of the province, and work with about 3,000 teachers. And just 2 quick points over here that these trainings are mandatory. So head teachers' decision to exert effort over here is very much a function of their own motivation and could arguably be compared to other non-student facing tasks, such as developing work plans or budgets. And the other is that understanding how to elicit the head teacher motivation in trainings, which could improve their learning, will have implications for school performance because head teachers are school leaders. So that in itself is substantively important, the question to understand how we can motivate head teachers to exert more effort in trainings. I'll say a little bit more about the experiment so it's clear before we move on to the results. So I mentioned that there are 4 different types of recognition schemes that are tied to the training test scores. The schemes are essentially recognition certificates that are signed by the head of the training academy. So they have legitimacy and they're given to the top 2 scorers and the 2 most improved scorers over the baseline. And the idea is to encourage effort across the distribution of ability. We've already seen this 2 by 2. So the first is the peer arm, which essentially looks at the peer channel. And over here, teachers who basically get the certificate, they're given the certificate publicly at a district ceremony in front of peers and colleagues. The idea is we're making peer esteem salient. The second arm is making career benefits salient. The recognition here is offered privately, but we make career benefits salient by telling teachers that if they qualify, their name will be added to a priority teacher list, which can basically create opportunities for them to qualify for opportunities that arise at the district level or at the head office. And over here, the reason why this works is because we know that in bureaucracy, career benefits, formal career benefits are limited because promotions are linked to seniority. But this is a system where there are informal career benefits because teachers could be posted to their school of liking. They could be selected for coveted pools of master trainers, which elevates their visibility. So the idea is the certificate can increase their likelihood of accessing these informal career benefits. And then, of course, there's these plus arms, which are mirror images of the first 2 arms, but we add a motivational framing. And broadly, the idea is that we add some motivational information around the administration of the reward, which is meant to boost motivation and beliefs and capabilities. I won't go into the design, but we basically borrow from Bandura's social learning theory to develop this framing. Our outcomes are training test scores because that's what the incentive is based on. We're also interested in some secondary outcomes, in particular, teacher intrinsic motivation and self-beliefs, because we expect that the incentives can also shape these, and specifically the motivational framing could shape these. So we also capture those. And we also collect data on a bunch of other variables. And one thing that we're really interested in testing is understanding whether these arms are working through our hypothesized theory. So just to give you an example, if we think the career benefits arm is going to increase the likelihood of being able to access these kind of informal career incentives, we want to learn what happens or whether teachers who are due for a promotion sooner or who are permanent employees will respond more to these kind of treatments. I'm going to jump to the findings now. I'm going to talk about 2 key findings, and then we're going to understand a little bit about how they're working. So first, we find that agents appear to respond to recognition rewards that make career benefits salient. And essentially in this context, what this implies is that teachers value the informal career benefits that exist in the system. So over here, you're seeing training, standardized training test scores. So we're observing effects in standard deviation units. We see that the peer arm is 0.03, close to 0, insignificant. With the career arm, it's a pretty large coefficient if we look at other training kind of interventions, and it's significant at the 10% level. So we're going to explore a little bit more as to what's happening with this and whether this arm is actually working because people are responding to the incentive. Interestingly, the second thing that we find is, if we think about the motivational framing, which was the other two arms, that adding the motivational framing backfires with negative effects on performance. This is not something that we hypothesized. We expected this to improve the framing, but this is in line with recent studies that we're seeing. For example, McKenzie et al., who basically have a psychological intervention on aspirations, and they show that aspirations backfire because people have unmet aspirations. So in this case, we want to understand what exactly happened with this arm. So this is basically the second effect. So over here, again, it's the same thing on the y-axis. The light blue are basically the plus arms, and you can see that the plus arms are moving in a negative direction. This is basically showing that the difference between the career and the career plus arm is negative and significant, which essentially means that the net impact of the framing is negative. Over here, I'm pooling the pure and career arm and the plus arms, and we can see that the plus arms are moving in a negative direction. So overall, the net impact of the framing is negative and significant.
Just under 5 minutes, Zahra.
So we've seen two results over here. The career arm appears to work. We want to understand what exactly is happening here. And we're seeing that the arms with motivational framing are moving in the opposite direction. So we want to understand why that is so. So I'm going to follow these two results one by one and show you a little bit more as to what's happening here. So we'll go to the career arm results first. So the first thing we want to understand is these are tournament-based rewards. And with these kind of rewards, one of the key questions is often that, is the effect only coming from the upper end of the distribution, or what's happening across the distribution? So we're going to look at quantile treatment effects to understand a little bit what's happening. So over here, you're seeing quantile treatment effects. The red is again the career arm and the blue is the pure arm. And you can see that the career arm is actually in the range of 0.27 to 0.35, pretty much across the distribution. It's always above the pure arm. When we look at the upper end of the distribution, the impacts over there are significant and also significantly different from the pure arm. So this tells us that the way agents are responding to the career arm appears to be different from the pure arm. We also want to understand whether our theory underlying the career arm is actually what's driving what we're seeing. So we're going to look at what's happening with people who are due for promotion sooner or are permanent employees. So over here, I'm showing you three things. Promotion, less time is anything less than 3 years. Secretary visits, more visits is anything that's more than once in 4 months. And contract type, whether it's a permanent contract or a temporary contract. And here you can see that basically the impacts are coming from people who have less time to promotion, which means that these are the people who will probably be thinking, how can I use this recognition incentive to get posting to a school of my liking? Similarly, people who have more secretary visits appear to respond more because these are people who are likely to have more visibility and can access these kind of informal benefits. And finally, with permanent employees, they're the ones who seem to be responding more. So this gives us some confidence that the effects are coming because of the theory that we hypothesized about how this arm is supposed to work. When we try to unpack the plus arms, the main kind of hypothesis over there was that this is a motivational framing, and this should improve the overall design by basically boosting people's motivation and their self-beliefs. So we can actually look at our secondary outcomes and see what's happening to motivation. So this is a motivation index, which is based on measures of intrinsic motivation, locus of control, and self-efficacy, all validated scales. And we can actually see that with the pure plus and the career plus, the effects are positive and significant. So clearly, the arms did not reduce motivation. They did what they were supposed to do, and yet we're seeing this decrease in performance. So the final question we want to ask is, why are we seeing this decrease in performance? And we basically wrestle with two kind of hypotheses in the paper. One is this effort reallocation hypothesis, that when we gave teacher this framing and all this extra information, it compromised their cognitive bandwidth and reallocated effort away from the training to other things. And the other hypothesis is that the plus arms improved teachers' motivation, but it made them overconfident in their ability to do well at the training. And we actually find evidence for the second hypothesis. We can build a direct measure of overconfidence because we measure teachers' beliefs about post-test performance. So essentially, beliefs about performance and actual performance gives us a direct measure of overconfidence. And here what you're seeing is that the plus arms make teachers more overconfident. So essentially what this means is that compared to the other arms, these arms clearly make teachers more overconfident. We also use mediation analysis based on the work of Acharya and et al. And we can actually explain 80% of the negative effects when we control for overconfidence. So finally, recognition can improve effort if career benefits are made salient, but these positive effects can backfire based on the framing of these incentives. And in this particular case, we find that motivational framing bolsters motivation and self-beliefs, which actually gives us confidence that these kind of interventions can work. But in this case, it overcorrects beliefs about ability, leading to overconfidence and reduced effort. And essentially, just very quickly, the key academic implication over here is that it helps us understand how agents exert effort in response to these kind of awards. In terms of the policy implication, it offers insights on how we can build soft but sharp recognition rewards, in this case by linking them to informal career benefits in the system. But the other equally important policy implication is that it highlights the highly contextual nature of these kind of incentives because of their sensitivity to framing effects. So there's this kind of advice in terms of caution in how these type of incentives are framed. And finally, in future extensions of the paper, I'm looking at downstream effects of what happens to school outcomes like teacher attendance, exam participation rates, and student passing rates based on these incentives and training. I have some early results, but I'll save them for another time. Thank you for listening.
Huge thanks, Zahra. That was a fantastic paper as well, and wonderful connections back to the first two papers. You missed out on a gold star by 1 minute, but that's still pretty good in the scheme of academic conferences. So I'll be generous and dole one out. So next up is Gabriela Smarrelli, who's a DPhil student at the University of Oxford, who works on the economics of education and public service delivery. And Gabriela, I think you're going to take us in a slightly different direction in a slightly different context as well.
That's correct. Thank you very much. So I'm going to still be talking about education, but now I'm going to shift to talk more about the particular effects of a policy that was aiming to train the school principals on the management of school violence. And this is evidence from a larger scale policy in Peru. Globally, a third of the students aged 13 to 15 years of age have been victims of school violence. And particularly Peru in the Latin American region is one of the countries with the highest victimization rates. And exposure to school violence has been proven to be detrimental for human capital formation and to undermine other investments in child development. We found evidence, empirical evidence shows that there is a relationship between school violence and lower achievement, higher dropout, higher mobility, and also higher mental health issues. And these are prevalent not only for the victims of school violence, but also for the perpetrators and the witnesses of school violence. Considering this, there has been an expansion in the number of policies, laws, and programs that are targeting the topic of school violence. However, there is limited understanding about how to effectively identify and manage cases of school violence, and also limited rigorous evidence on what are the effects of investing on this. So this paper aims to contribute to this by analyzing the impacts of a Peruvian large-scale intervention that trained the school heads on the management of school violence. And I'm going to evaluate the impacts of this intervention by using a fuzzy regression discontinuity design that exploits the eligibility rules that were used by the ministries to select the beneficiary schools. And I'm going to be discussing what are the short-term impacts on violence-related outcomes and also educational-related outcomes. As a preview of the findings, I observed that this intervention increased the likelihood of reporting violence among beneficiary schools by around 37 percentage points. I also observed that there was an increase in the number of reports of violence, in average by 1 report, and I will be discussing what is the story behind the results in the next slides. upon exploring the educational related outcomes, I observed that there was a decrease in the likelihood of switching schools, evidence that might be signaling that there were improvements in the school environment. And I do not observe effects related to school dropout and test scores, and I will also be discussing this a bit more. In the interest of time, I will just briefly mention that this paper relates and contributes to three main streams of literature. One is the scarce literature analyzing what is the impact of specific programs that are targeting the topic of school violence. The other stream of literature relates to the school management literature, but in my case, I'm looking into particular managerial skills that relate to school violence. And finally, it also relates to the literature on human capital formation by studying the impacts on educational outcomes. So what data do I use to study this research question? So I'm going to use different sources of administrative data that is available for all the public schools in Peru. And the main novelty of this data set is that I have access to information on the school violence reports. And I will also be using primary data that allows me to explore a bit more what are the mechanisms behind my results. So now I'm gonna discuss more the intervention. This intervention was a technical assistance that was designed by the Ministry of Education in Peru and was implemented by the local offices of the ministry that are located around the provinces, different provinces of the country. And the intervention was organized in 3 cycles of training activities. The first cycle of activities was focused on the identification and management of school violence. And one of the main activities here involved training the school principals on the protocols related to how to deal with cases of violence, depending on whether they were cases of physical, sexual, or verbal violence. The second cycle of activities was training the school principals on the topic of positive discipline strategies. And this was with the aim of moving away from punitive discipline that was very prevalent in the Peruvian context. And then finally, the last cycle of training activities involved the development of school coexistent rules. And as I mentioned previously, this intervention was mainly targeting and training the school principals, an agent that is crucial in shaping the culture and the environment of the school. Because of budget constraints, it was not possible to train all on this topic, all the schools in the country. Instead, the intervention was offered to 12 schools located in each of the local offices of the Ministry of Education. And they when they were offering this intervention, they divided the schools into 2 sets of schools. 3 schools that were called the nuclear schools and 9 schools that were called the adjacent schools. The nuclear schools were selected as beneficiary schools based on 3 characteristics. That is their levels of school violence, the distance they had to the local office of the ministry, and the number of enrolled students. In the case of the adjacent schools, what they did was to choose the top 9 schools that were closest in distance to the nuclear schools and that had the highest number of enrolled students. In this graph, the adjacent schools refers to the blue schools, whether the nuclear schools refers to the black schools. And in this paper, I'm mainly going to focus on the adjacent schools because considering that the nuclear schools were also exposed to a different intervention, making it more harder for me to disentangle the effects of the technical assistance. Another reason why I focus in the adjacent schools is because the eligibility rules provide an opportunity to use a facet regression discontinuity design to assess the impacts of this intervention. So let's discuss a bit more these eligibility rules. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to exploit these eligibility rules used to select the adjacent schools. The eligibility criteria used by the ministry mimic what is considered a ranking procedure, in which the top 9 schools of the ranking were selected to receive the intervention, whether those that were just above this threshold rule of 9 were not chosen, considering that they were a bit farther away from the nuclear schools or because they had a lower number of enrolled students. The Ministry of Education only kept information and a record of the schools that were assigned to treatment. Considering this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replicate the ranking procedure that they use, and I'm going to use this ranking as my discrete running variable. What we observed from this graph is that there was a clear jump in the probability of being treated, where we observed that the schools located below the threshold were more likely to receive the intervention. A second thing that we observed in this graph is that this jump in the probability of treatment jumps in less than 1. And this is in line with what would happen when the program was being implemented, considering that there were certain exceptions that were made in the selection of some schools. To estimate the impacts of the intervention, I'm going to use the standard 2-stage least square procedure that is going to allow me to estimate the local average treatment effects of the intervention. And before showing you the results, I just wanted to mention that I observed that the schools were not aware of the eligibility criteria, and the Ministry of Education used pre-treatment data to be able to create this eligibility, to create the ranking. And in general, I observed that there was no manipulation of the values of the eligibility variables. I also observed that the pretreatment outcomes and the majority of the covariates vary smoothly around the threshold. And in my different specifications, I observed a strong first stage. Now I'm going to move to the results, and I will first discuss results related to school violence, and then I'm going to move into a discussion about the educational related outcomes. You're going to be seeing in the next slides tables similar to this one, where the first 2 columns are showing us the results from a linear specification, and columns 3 and 4 are showing the results from a quadratic specification. Columns 2 and 4 are adding control variables. Moreover, in the first row, we observe the local average treatment effects that come from estimating the 2-stage least square procedure. And the second row is showing the intention to treat effects that come from an OLS regression. And overall, what we observe is that there was an increase in the likelihood of reporting at least one case of school violence, and this increased by around 37 percentage points. I also noticed that there was an increase in the average number of reports of violence, and this is an increase in average of 1 report that is mainly driven by an extensive margin, meaning the schools that are reporting a case of violence for the first time after the intervention, and these are schools that reported in average 1 case of violence. So how do we interpret this increase in the likelihood of reporting? I analyzed different data on this, and evidence suggests that there was actually a reduction in the barriers to reporting. And now I'm going to discuss the different pieces of evidence that led me to conclude that this is a plausible story. First of all, I observed that this likelihood of reporting violence is higher among the schools that registered a case of violence for the first time after the intervention. This is an interesting result because these are the schools that were perhaps facing the biggest barriers to reporting before the intervention. I also observed that the beneficiary schools work on more tasks that are related to the management of school violence. And these are tasks that have the potential to reduce barriers to reporting. Just to give you an example, one of these tasks relates to the dissemination of information about the platforms available to reporting. And their beneficiary schools worked more on this. And this can contribute, for example, to reducing information barriers to reporting. An alternative story could be that my results perhaps are actually showing increases in violence levels. To analyze this better, it would have been ideal to access victimization data. This is data in which each of the students in the schools would indicate whether they were victims of school violence or not. I do not have access to these, but I have access to survey data for students aged 14 years of age, in which they are asked if they have witnessed cases of violence within their school. I use this data to create an index of perceptions of violence. And what I observe is that there is no statistical significant difference between beneficiary schools and control schools. I also noticed that the coefficient is actually negative, indicating that the perceptions of school violence were actually better in the beneficiary schools. So overall, these findings would contribute to signal that there were not necessarily increases in violence levels, and that I'm mainly capturing a change in reporting behavior.
About 2 minutes left, Gabriela. Sorry, I missed your 5-minute mark.
No problem. Regarding educational related outcomes, I observed that there was a decrease in the student mobility. And I observed that the results are robust, for instance, when I account for residential mobility. And this could be signaling improvements in the school environment overall. I do not observe results related to dropout. And in the case of learning, I observe that the estimated coefficients are positive, suggesting improvements in learning. However, I do not observe statistical significant results in the short term, leaving open future research to understand if there will be effects in the medium and long term. And just to conclude, with this research, I observed that training school principals on the school management of violence had effects in the likelihood of reporting violence and also in decreasing student mobility. And my results point to the importance of reducing barriers to reporting, as this is a first crucial step in the fight towards preventing future cases of violence. And future work, I hope that these results really incentivize future work to try to understand and disentangle better the relationship between violence, school environments, and learning in the medium and long term. Thank you.
Gabriela, thank you so much for that. That was a super interesting presentation as well, and of a kind of difficult topic to study. And I think you found a really creative, but also really clear way to do that. So thank you. So we've got 20 minutes now to chat. What I'm going to propose is that we kind of get all of the questions out there first, and then we'll do a kind of run through the panelists based on that. We haven't had any questions submitted yet from the attendees, but Amira, Archita, and Giala, please do feel free to put questions in now or raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you. I'm sure each of us has some feedback and questions for the others. I will abuse chair's privilege and get started with a couple questions for each of you. So Nikita, I thought that this was super interesting and kind of obviously important and policy relevant. I'm curious for your thoughts about kind of what do we actually learn from either a theoretical or empirical perspective relative to the existing literature. I kind of I think you posed a clear question and answered it really well, but kind of how do you see the contribution on the existing kind of body of knowledge about these questions? And then the second question is, about kind of the difference between stated preferences versus revealed preferences, and how confident are you, or how do you think we should think about whether kind of responses to these type of discrete choice experiments translate into actual expressed behavior as well. For Damien, this is another one that I loved, and I think it's, you capture something that's in a way so simple and obvious, that, like, of course, like the nature of the task itself matters, and of course, every job involves a range of tasks of different kinds of concentrations, and so I thought, this is actually an insight that's really, really actionable and important, and has all kind of potential to for measurement and further study and kind of policy implications. One question is, how do you think that you could measure kind of task boringness or task motivation in the field, or kind of through a survey rather than a lab experimental setup? Another thing is, I was trying to think through applying this to actual job kind of job design and management questions, is that, in the real world, to an extent, tasks associated with a job are fixed, but to an extent they're also endogenous, and that people can kind of choose which things they're responsible for, that they put more or less effort into. And in the management literature, there's a whole literature called on job crafting, which is the idea that what a lot of workers do, especially professionals, is kind of endogenously shape their job in order to make it contain the type of tasks that they enjoy doing. And so just thinking about that as a kind of challenge to taking this type of insight into the real world. For Zahra, so I thought this was super interesting and super clear and really, really well presented. And it seems to me like there's actually like more than one theoretical contribution you're making, and you kind of, but then it felt to me like you didn't quite state it explicitly. You kind of said, I'm making all these contributions, I'm making contributions to the theory of recognition and reward design and stuff. But I'm curious, from your perspective, like, what is the insight that you think can travel and can be generalizable for this kind of theory? And then for Gabriela, I think the finding about reporting is really interesting, and you, in your conclusion, you kind of frame the results as in saying, it's really important to increase reporting of violence because it's a first step towards improving it. And I wondered, to me that seems totally plausible, but I wonder if that's something that you can actually find a way to give us some evidence of, right? Like, is more reporting just better for data, or can you actually show a way in which kind of within your data and your sample report, better reporting is associated with more action, even if not necessarily more outcomes? So maybe there's something that you can do within the kind of intensive margins schools, or I'm not totally sure, but that was, I think it's super interesting. But then I can envision some seminar participants saying like, okay, but reporting, great, so what? And so I wonder if there's a way to strengthen that a bit. So let me throw it open now. Anything from the four of you or other speakers? Damien?
Any additional questions?
Yep, additional questions, comments, feedback.
If I may add one for Zahra. It's more like a detail. So you at the end you mentioned overconfidence, and I'm curious how you measure overconfidence.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Damien. Zahra, do you have?
Yeah. So I think for Nikita, only if there's time, I was just wondering what pre-work you did to identify the levels of the attributes. only because I'm trying to do something similar. So, or we could chat offline, but that was for you. For Damien, I was just thinking, and maybe that's because I don't understand the distinction between task motivation and mission motivation very well. But I was just thinking that, you know, based on the task motivation in your example, there's mission motivation is kind of part of it because it's linked to what these medical students are doing. So how would you, so is there a way to maybe think about task motivation that does not include the mission of those individuals as well? Or how would you think about the fact that there might be impacts of mission motivation within this specific task motivation example? So I was just thinking in my head that, you know, how do I ensure that this task motivation example isn't already capturing mission motivation, which is why you probably didn't see any impacts of the mission intervention. And for Gabriela, so I was just thinking how, so you say that, you know, this removes barriers to reporting and you see impacts on reporting, but I was also thinking if you could say a bit more like, what is this context like? And why are there barriers to reporting in the first place? And why is this just not about knowledge? Because, you know, the intervention probably told head teachers how to identify violence. So maybe it's just that their knowledge improved and they've just reported more because there was more awareness of what's violence and what's not. So I was just thinking about that. And yeah, if you could say a bit more about that, that would be great.
Thanks, Zahra. Nikita, Gabriela?
I had a question about for Damien. It kind of sort of piggybacks on what Zahra asked, the distinguish between task motivation and mission motivation. And I've been reading a lot of literature about how pro-sociality and pro-social preferences they're not quite intrinsic motivation, but they're part of that realm of motivation. And you mentioned, so I wondered in your sort of framework where pro-social motivation fell. Was it task or mission or neither? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll maybe piggyback off that question and add another question that I had for Damien that's related, which was, so if I understood correctly, your measure of motivation came from a dictator game, which, so I usually associate dictator games with pro-sociality and kind of mission with more kind of intrinsic motivation. And so it might just be a kind of semantic thing of, you know, me having different expectations. I don't know if that's just a kind of norm or if that's actually grounded in the literature. But that was a point where I was also had a question of whether you're measuring kind of something that's more like pro-sociality or more like mission alignment / intrinsic motivation. Gabriela.
I don't have something specific. I had a point that is very similar to what you just mentioned and also Nikita. And because I was also curious on understanding, and it relates also to the work of Damien and work that I'm doing currently on trying to understand the role of mission alignment in performance. So I was curious on perhaps if you could expand a bit more on the role of being of alignment in this idea of mission motivation and the difference with task motivation, particularly considering that to measure mission motivation, you use something related to the education sector, right? So it's more that it doesn't relate necessarily to what they are more workers, but yes, something that relates perhaps to their pro-social motivation to help. So it's more a comment related to
that. Sorry about that. My earphone battery died in the middle of your question, Gabriela, so I might have missed something, but hopefully Damien got it. So let's just go around in the, oh, sorry, we have one question in the Q&A as well. Archita, do you want to ask your question yourself? If we can unmute you.
Hi
Go
there.
ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure. I'm just going to read it out. It was for Zahra, and I was just wondering if it's also about how the lessons can travel to other contexts from the paper and the experiment. And I was wondering how could we go about disentangling the peer effect channel and the career recognition channel. Often the latter would, subsume recognition amongst your community, even if it was not publicly done. So yeah, that was kind of it. Thanks.
All right, great. So let's go to Nikita first of all.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for these really interesting questions. So to start off with the first one, which was what was the real policy relevance and contribution given the existing literature on these topics. Well, firstly, I think there's a lot of literature that looks at motivation and its association with health workers, but they're mostly doctors and nurses, so standardized cadres of health workers. And because motivation is so much sort of driven by your career standing, your training, and those types of things, I think it's quite important to sort of tailor it to people, different cadres. And so community health workers who happen to be a huge part of the Ethiopian health workforce, there isn't much literature in general on how motivation associates with their job preferences. So this was, in my knowledge, the only study that really looks at it quantitatively and measures the two. I also think that the relevance is methodological because, yeah, I think there's been a lot of qualitative work that has looked at the two, linking it, and I think that's really relevant and important. However, I think in the setup of a discrete choice experiment, so discrete choice experiments are becoming extremely popular in the health, especially in health economics, and people tend to use psychological constructs. I was at a conference the other day, and people tend to use these types of measures very sort of off the bat, just like they would use, other deterministic characteristics. Mm-hmm. So I think it comes, it's also a methodological contribution, particularly for health economists, to be wary of how to measure and link these types of characteristics. Mm-hmm. And if you're able to do so, I think the hope is, and I think obviously that's a very naive hope that, policymakers will pick up your evidence and implement policy changes. But I think the one thing that's also really important that was alluded by, all the other papers, that it's not always big, financial factors that really matter in jobs. If policymakers were to change people's jobs, it's not just that they would have to change salaries and reallocate budget, etc. There's so much other stuff that's happening that often kind of is not understood by policymakers and managers. So it's good to have that kind of evidence, I suppose. In terms of the external validity of discrete choice experiments and how they compare with revealed preference data. So revealed preference is where the data exists. You can ask people whether you chose job A or job B rather than what would you choose. But that kind of data, if it exists, requires trials and lots of you need to spend a lot of money to be collecting that data. It is not easily available, especially if you're trying to come up with policies. So jobs don't exist like that. You're trying to hypothesize how a job would be. So it is very much a hypothetical situation in that sense. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests that actually if discrete choice experiments are designed really well, they can be externally valid. And they're not very generalizable, but if for a particular kind of a setting, they can be relied on, which kind of gets me to Zahra's point, which was that for our particular work, so before doing a discrete choice experiment, it's recommended that you do significant formative work, which includes qualitative work with your participants to try and understand what are the things that they value, and then sort of narrow it down to say about 5 to 7 attributes in a discrete choice experiment, and then sort of hone that down into, and that's through key informant interviews and focus group discussions to try and hone that down into what could be the potential levels, because they need to be relevant to your population. Otherwise, there would be stuff like attribute non-attendance, heuristics people would use. If things are not relevant to them, they would just ignore them, which would mess up the whole methodological framework. So that's what we did. We did some qualitative work with our respondents. We did a lot of literature review, so looking at existing papers to see what they used, how best to use them, whether to use pictures along with text or not. So those kind of discussions were had, and then we kind of moved forward with the design. And I'd be very happy to chat with you offline if you like. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikita. So I'm just flagging for time that we're probably going to run a few minutes over. But for those of you who are here, then hopefully there's enough incentive to stay for five extra minutes or so. Let's go to Damien now.
Okay, thanks, and thanks a lot for all the very good questions. So a lot of related questions. I might mix them a little bit. Hopefully you'll get your answer. So no, I acknowledge that there is in the medical task something that is not only task, but is also mission, because after all, these are all medical or nursing students that are motivated not only by doing tasks that they think it's interesting, but also by healing people. That's going to be their job. So, and that's difficult to distinguish. I mean, in our little experiment, it should have been clear that looking at this video and answering the question would not actually make anybody healthier. So it's still a task, but I mean, it's not like if they were in front of an actual mother with a child with severe malaria. But we were conscious of this. I mean, our experiment is an attempt to distinguish the mission motivation, which, by the way, is sort of the same in our mind with pro-social, from the task motivation, but it's imperfect. That was also why we chose the mission motivation to not be in the health sector, to be in the education sector with this poor school, because otherwise we were worried of the interaction between task and mission. So we could have said, well, the money goes to a poor hospital in Burkina Faso. To try to have better distinction between task and mission motivation, we decided to have it in another sector, but make it clear it was for the poor. Again, it's probably imperfect. The measure in the dictator game, so we think it's a modified dictator game in the sense that it doesn't go to another unknown person or another person. It goes to a charity, and we show the school. So we think in measure altruism or pro-social behavior, but we use that measure that we had in the dictator game mainly as a control variable in our regressions. That's not our main measure. How to measure boringness in real world? I think mainly by observation, but maybe I shouldn't advocate that. During COVID, or well, I'm not working for a university, but some of you are. I think there were at least for people working with a computer, there is a way to see if you stay focused or if you go on your phone or something like that. I know when I do a boring task like reading proofs of a paper, which I've done this morning, every 3 minutes I have to stop and I go and watch some news on my phone. When I actually write a page from a paper, I think I do it less often. So there must be a way. I don't know if it's a very ethical way to do it. I think we do, more seriously I do a lot of work in the health sector also, not only with lab in the field experiment. And we do direct observations of health worker patient interactions. And I think obviously that's not a boring task, but people can be bored, even doctors can be both. So I think there must be probably you can measure that. I guess also teacher, there must be, I know there are also measure of classroom interactions. And I guess it's not so much a measure of the boringness of the task, but there must be a way. Last point was, yes, how you deal with the task is endogenous, and you can make a boring task more enjoyable. I know it because I do the laundry in my household, believe it or not, and it's enjoyable because I do it with listening to an audiobook. So, but yes, I mean, it's a stupid example, but it's true that even boring tasks can be made a little bit more enjoyable. But I'm not sure I know how to deal with that. How to deal with that in measurement. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Damien. Well, just to reassure you, like, those of us who work in universities never get distracted or bored with any of the tasks that we have to do. So I couldn't really relate to that when you were talking about it, but intellectually I understand. Zahra.
Yeah. No, thanks for all the questions. So I think the first question about the contributions. So that was one part that I took out to save time, but I'm glad you asked because I can clarify it now. So I think the main kind of contribution is, I mean, when we look at recognition, generally the way it's been modeled, it has been like one extrinsic incentive in reduced form, and it's not really clear what are the channels. So I think the key kind of contribution is trying to isolate the peer esteem and the career benefits channel of recognition. So if we think about this as being an extrinsic incentive with one kind of, which is generally modeled as like just one incentive, one could imagine breaking this up and thinking about what kind of utility do you attach to, like, peer esteem, which could again be dependent on many different things, the ability of your peers, how much you respect them, so on and so forth. And at the same time, you could have, you could try and understand how much utility do you attach to the career benefits channel. So one is trying to isolate these channels. And then the second kind of main contribution is that we're trying to understand how the impact of framing effects. So if we look at the existing literature, it's mostly incentives have either been framed as incentives or losses. But there isn't really a lot of attention on what happens when you frame them with motivational information. And this is important also because when we look at recognition, it's mostly seen as an extrinsic incentive, but it's not clear that these kind of incentives will only affect your extrinsic motivation. So when I spoke about in the presentation that these kind of incentives can be perceived as controlling, they can impact your employee morale, beliefs about capabilities, there's actually kind of, your intrinsic utility is being affected by these kind of incentives as well. So you can almost imagine that your utility depends on extrinsic rewards that you're getting from recognition, but at the same time, intrinsic utility, because the way you're going to respond, your effort will also depend on, the information and how you're reacting with the information. So that's kind of the main contribution, trying to isolate the peer esteem and the career benefits, and also understanding framing effects, which is essentially arguing that you need to think about intrinsic utility as well. I've been trying to work on something as an appendix section, which tries to lay this out in a little bit more detail, but we can also chat about this separately. On the question in the chat from from Archita. So I think that's actually a really important question, and one that I specifically tried to disentangle in this study, because all the literature on recognition the existing papers will often say this is the impact of employer recognition and this is the impact of a community recognition arm. But they won't really look at the different channels within each. And community recognition is very different from, employer recognition, which is often based within, the organization. Because when you start inviting community members and so on and so forth, that's a whole different type of incentive. So in this experiment, I specifically tried to disentangle them because the main kind of motivation was also to understand how can governments design this. And in this particular context, I wanted to focus on employer recognition and not conflate it with community recognition. But one could very well ask the question whether community recognition would just be more effective for teachers. Maybe they don't care about employer recognition, but that's kind of a different question. On the measurement of overconfidence, so generally, so our measure of overconfidence is slightly different from the typical measure, where you'll see that, you know, there's a bunch of statements and people will respond to what the correct answer is, and they'll rate their, you know, level of confidence for each statement. And then essentially the difference between the confidence levels and what they report is overconfidence. But over here, what we have is, which we also see in some studies, a more direct measure of overconfidence, because essentially we want to understand, you know, what your own beliefs are compared to a gold standard. And over here, because we have training test scores, that's their actual performance. But at N-line, we also ask trainees to report on their beliefs about performance. So there was a question in the N-line survey, which basically asked, how much did you think you performed on the test? And because we were interested in understanding beliefs about test performance as well. So because of that, we were able to construct a direct measure of overconfidence, which is essentially your beliefs about performance, which was essentially, you know, something they reported from 1 to 100, and their actual performance, and that difference basically becomes the overconfidence measure. In the mediation analysis, we had to predict overconfidence, because obviously, you know, there's mechanical correlation between our outcome measure and overconfidence. So we had to do something different over there, which I can talk about maybe offline, but that was our measure. I think those were the questions for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Zahra. Gabriela.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to answer both your question, Martin, and Zahra together, because I think they were also related. So this intervention was designed by the ministry in a context where they really wanted to tackle the topic of punitive discipline, because there was many cases of teacher to student violence. And also in the context of some cases of that happen of sexual violence. So that really inspired the ministry to try to look more into how to really discuss this topic, and basically how to provide skills to the school staff to actually be able to manage these complex situations. In the qualitative context, and this is based in interviews with the school principals, they really highlighted that before the intervention, they knew that there were cases of school violence, but they were not necessarily perhaps putting the importance in it needed, and in terms of encouraging for them to be reported and doing something about it. So in a way, the intervention contributed to normalizing that it's important to register the cases of violence. Related to that, when we see this increase in the reports of violence, it's important to say that this is not an increase driven only by the same school staff reporting cases. So it's also the students and the family of the students and the peers that can report a case of violence. So it's not that this is mainly explained by the same school principal that was trained going into a platform and reporting a case. So they have to actually, if a student goes to a school staff and reports a case of violence, the school staff, of course, would then report it in the platform. But the main, but it's also the other members of the community that report the cases of violence in general. And in terms of, yes, we find that there is an increase in reporting, and the next question is, so what do we do next? And I think here, having the ability to continue exploring this topic in the longer term will allow me to answer better your question. Also to understand if there is kind of, there's changing behavior in terms of reporting. It would be important to know if it's sustained over time, and it would be crucial to compare it with victimization data, because that would allow me to understand better whether the victimization data reflects decreases in violence, but it could also be showing increases in reporting in general, until there is a point where we would hope there is no more violence. And I think also related to that, yes, I think that the other evidence in the paper more related to educational related outcomes, like for instance, reduction in the likelihood of switching schools and changing schools, is something interesting as a result of the study, because it might be reflecting that the student is feeling more comfortable in their own school. And that I consider that an important finding. And I think for the future, it would be great to know if there are more effects in the medium term in terms of learning. And I will access more data in the next months that would allow me to explore this better. So I think I will be able to answer that question better in the next months.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabriela. And thanks to all four of you. I thought those were four really genuinely wonderful presentations that linked really well together and kind of bode really well for the frontier of work in health and education and service delivery economics. And as a devoted scholar of bureaucracy, that makes me really happy. So thank you all for coming. Thanks also to our attendees, and hope to see you in other sessions and in future years of the CSAE conference as well.